Next question, which is how do we connect with Gen Z?
Yeah.
This will probably get its own clip just because I really want to give you a moment
Yeah.
to really go through and summarize what you presented at the Telios Conference regarding the next generation and trauma and what you're noticing. I'm really excited to bring it home with this one. So
Mhm.
share with us about this one. I'm really excited.
Yeah. So, um, in my work, I teach a big range of students and range of classes. Um, I teach predominantly undergraduate students, though I've taught graduate students, and I'm going to be teaching some doctoral students later this year. But I mostly teach undergraduate students, and most of my undergrad students are Gen Z. And this past year, I entered into this new role as tenure track assistant professor, and I get
Wow.
into the classroom with my students, and after day one, I'm like, who the heck are these people? I mean, I thought I understood students. I thought I had gotten it. And so I go back up to the offices and I go knock on my colleagues' doors and I'm like, who are these people? Like, I don't know who they are. I don't know what I'm interacting with. And they were like, we are baffled too. And so then I went to upperclassmen. I went to some seniors and I was like, what can you tell me about these freshmen that I'm meeting? And they were like, we got nothing. We don't know. It's like, oh, so I started really paying attention, like, oh my gosh, like who are these people? Because as a professor, I know I will be most effective as a teacher if I have a sense of where my students are, right? I've got to figure out where they are so that I can communicate in a way that meets them. And so I one of the classes that I teach is called Cornerstone, and it's kind of like a welcome to university class. Here are the skills you will need. Here are kind of the basics that you're going to need going forward. And so I was teaching Cornerstone this past year, and on Mondays all of the sections of Cornerstone gather together in a big amphitheater, and it's like one of these rare moments where all the freshmen are all together. And those of us who teach those classes have this like unique opportunity to sit in a space with all of them for a little bit. And so you get a sense for kind of their cohort. You get a sense for the culture that's emerging among them. And every year at one of these Monday spotlight lectures, one of our professors poses this thought experiment to our students. And he says, if you were the ambassador of the future, like imagine that's a thing, imagine that's a job, like a government level job. Your job as ambassador of the future is to meet with global leaders and raise their awareness to global issues. And presuming that they have the resources it takes to meet these issues. What issues as ambassador of the future would you raise? Like, what do we need to have our attention fixed on, for the next 10, 20, 50, or 100, 500 years? What is it that we need to be thinking about? Every time that he has asked this question in the past, like I taught this course when I taught earlier before starting my PhD, and every time among these like very young millennial students, the conversation is just buzzing, and they're raising all kinds of things, climate change, like the economy, and what is that country doing with that country, or what's happening with this war or this crisis, and they could all be thinking in terms of future, like future infrastructure, things like that. This time, for the first time ever that I had seen, the question is asked and the room is silent.
Hmm.
And like you hear like a low hum. There's some people whispering and thinking, but it's not bustling by any means. And I look at my students and they're all just sitting there just kind of stunned. And so then I'm like, well, maybe they're just shy. Maybe I have a shy batch of students. So I start walking around trying to engage them. Hey, what would you turn your attention to? What future crises? And they're like, we don't know.
Hmm.
And I was like, what do you mean you don't know? And they're like, how could I know what the future holds? And I was like, well, is there anything like what do you think might be a problem in 10 years? I don't know. So I'm like, oh gosh, so I left that. And with my trauma education, with me, I was like, this has some trauma vibes. Um, so I logged that away and thought, I'm going to keep working with this. So I get into the classroom with them on Wednesday. And I think, okay, I'm going to creatively find a way to reopen this and try to get them in. So we do some different things in the classroom. And finally, I kind of toss it back to them. I'm like, hey, let's try to envision the future together. What problems do you see in like 5 years, 10 years, 15 years? And they're blank again. But now they can sense that they've been getting it wrong, because I brought it back up. And so now they're like, uh-oh. So they're trying, and they're genuinely trying. But every answer that they pull forward is either a current or past problem. So they're like, the rise of social media. And I'm like, well, that already happened. Well, they're like, the COVID vaccine. And I'm like, that was already developed. That already happened, or one of them was like, a tornado just hit my hometown. And I'm like, I mean, that's a present crisis, and so they were having trouble breaking into that future vision. And I realized that all the examples they were bringing forward were specific, concrete examples of wounds that they are presently carrying. There was no kind of like figurative, theoretical, like, well, this economic problem in this other country, like, it was all, here's my wound, here's my wound, here's my wound, and I can't see beyond it. And so I started thinking about this generation, and I have drawn from that anecdote to kind of reflect on some of the struggle of Gen Z. Something that a lot of people say about Gen Z is that they're constantly wanting to talk about mental health. And like older generations, like millennials, Gen X, and boomers, they're like, ugh, like, why can't we re-stigmatize mental health? Like Gen Z just wants to talk about mental health all the time. And like there's this kind of like caricature that emerges of like almost like petulant children who all think that they're having a crisis, and then these like super stable adults who like are just tired of it. And and I'm like, okay, what I'm seeing here is actually different generational responses to wounds, different generational responses to trauma. Because older generations have also carried trauma, just maybe different kinds of trauma, and have also been culturally shaped in different ways to respond to those traumatic wounds in different ways. Gen Z has had what I would consider to be just an inordinate, excessive kind of cultural exposure to trauma. So when I presented this material at the Telios Conference, I highlighted a few of these areas. So one is the rise of gun violence. As a millennial, I remember the shooting at Columbine as being a pivotal moment. There's before Columbine and there's after.
Absolutely.
And so before Columbine, school is a safe place. Always, inherently, school is a safe place. You don't talk to strangers on the way home when you're walking home, but like otherwise, school is safe. Post Columbine, it fractured that narrative. There was like a tear in that narrative. And so you knew from that point on, there's always the possibility that school might not be safe. And so after Columbine, you started to gradually see the rise of securitization of schools. But even as millennials witnessed the rise of securitization of schools, it was always fixed to the before and after narrative. The idea that school was once safe, maybe it can be safe again, right? Is kind of the thought. Like something has gone wrong to make school unsafe. For Gen Z, they have never known school as being a safe place.
Wow.
For them, it's always been an inherently risky place. Because Gen Z, from the time they were very little, they were doing school shooting drills. And they were being sold backpacks that are bulletproof, and they were being given those talks from their parents about being safe at school and what to do if there's a school shooter. And by this point, the statistics are horrifying. The vast percentage of Gen Z Americans who have either experienced school shootings firsthand or have loved ones who have been involved in school shootings or exist in the same communities as school shootings. And so you have people who have firsthand kind of traumatic encounters, right? They are those kids who are hiding in the bathroom stall, hearing gunshots, and there's trauma. But you also have kind of a secondary trauma. The kid who's in the neighboring town who knows that just happened in close proximity and it could happen here. And it's kind of a traumatic exposure. Not to mention the impact of social media. Kids are seeing and hearing these stories with greater frequency. The internet and social media kind of gives a sense that the traumatic wounds are everywhere all at once. There's no escaping them. They're everywhere. They're bleeding over into everything. And so there is no escape, really. It's setting the terms for their existence.
Wow.
The world feels dangerous and scary. And the truth is, like, a lot of Gen Z don't even know to say that that's how it feels because for them, this is just baseline. Like, this is just normal.
Right.
And so they don't know even to say, like, the world feels comparatively scary. For them, they're just anxious and they don't know why. So like what I see in my students a lot of times is as they're coming into the college experiences, they're just rattled. Like there's this high anxiety wafting off of them. They're in their limbic system, right? Like they're in that limbic response, like, and they don't know that it could be any other way. They're just kind of like their nerves are singed, they're just constantly exposed to the traumatic wounding. Um, and then, add to the fact that they were in a really critical time of adolescence when COVID hit. And so, you think about the age of like 15, 16, 17, that's a critical time where a teenager should be asserting their independence. And it's awful for parents. Parents hate it usually because it's scary.
Yeah.
Their kid gets a driver's license and, the kid breaks curfew, right? And the parent's panicking. But then the kid makes it home safe. And it's like, hey, there were rules in place. They tested the rules. We worried. But the parent learns in that moment that sometimes, you don't know where your kid is and they could still be safe.
Mm.
And so there's like an important stage there in that parent-child relationship where the kid is gaining independence and the parent is learning to let go a little bit, and there's rules in place. But also the parent is coming to terms with the fact that soon that teenager is going to be a young adult calling the shots. And so think about that critical age. Think about Gen Z and how many of them were either in that stage or going to be entering into that stage soon when COVID hit. And so now they're at home or they're being heavily monitored. The parents are already just kind of freaked out and rattled by everything that's happening around them. And the kids, again, they don't have a sense for how this differs from anybody else's teenage experience. They're smart enough to know it probably does, but they don't even know fully what they've missed. It's just, again, it's setting the terms. And so the mass traumatic exposure is setting the terms for this generational cohort. And so I've described it as a traumatized age. And that's my way of trying to get at the way that the culture of this generational cohort has been shaped by traumatic wounding. And it's important to say that not every person who is Gen Z is traumatized necessarily, right? Like trauma it has its own kind of distinct pathology in the clinical sense. Not everybody is traumatized. Not everybody is a trauma survivor. Um, and yet, the mass exposure to trauma and the prevalence of traumatic wounding in this generation means that the culture has been shaped by traumatic wounds and traumatic responses. They've been socialized in this way. And so where I kind of bring that back around to my opening anecdote is that, I'm receiving a generation of students in my Bible classrooms, in my theology and ministry classrooms. I'm receiving a generational cohort that is impacted by kind of the nature of trauma. And part of what comes with that is difficulty envisioning the future, because the past wound is always interrupting the present. It's always laying claim to the present. The fear of that crisis, that threat, is always inbreaking. And it's setting the terms for how one thinks about themselves in the world and how they envision themselves in the future. And so there's a study that I cite in that plenary that I gave, which, by the way, I am reworking for an article in Telios Journal.
Yes, very, very good.
But there's a study that I cite where they discover that incoming Gen Z students, when they go to college, fewer and fewer go to college with the thought that this will be a formative experience, that it'll be a time for them to discern like their calling or their vocation. More and more they're going to college because they need financial security. And they are going to go to college to figure out how to make money to be safe in this kind of perilous, difficult to imagine future. So they're equipping themselves for the unknown future, which must be scary. It must be tenuous, because that's what trauma does, right? Is it makes the future like a really bad dream. And so they're arming themselves, they're equipping themselves for a struggle, for a fight, rather than being able to enter into college as young adults, ready to trial and error, ready to fail at some things and succeed in others, ready to kind of like go into the professor's office and say, what do I want to be when I grow up? Those conversations have been suspended. And instead, you've got students who are going, I need to get my ducks in a row. I'm going to save this much money so that I can advance in this way in my career, so I can provide for my family, so that someday my kids have what they need. And it's just a different way of thinking about the future. In some ways, it reminds me of like the Great Depression era, where there's like this reckoning, a fearful reckoning with human vulnerability. And so a whole generation goes, we're in survival mode, tie your money into your curtains, hide it under your couches, like make things secure as possible for this unknown, scary future. And I see that happening with Gen Z. And where that troubles me as a theology professor is I'm seeing that it makes it very hard for this generation to feel hope, or to cultivate hope, to build their lives according to hope. Because hope requires a kind of openness to the future. But if the future is really scary, then you're not really open to it. You're kind of guarding against it, And so in my plenary, I talked about the importance of helping, like coming alongside this generation, listening intently to their wounds, taking seriously what they are disclosing to us about their mental health, and then being able to come into that relationship with them and gradually help them build a hopeful framework for the future. And so something I talked about in my plenary is just some basic kind of trauma-informed approaches to this.
Real quick, Amy, I just want to say what you're saying, this is what softened everyone's heart in the room at that conference. Yeah. Because what you're doing right now, again, you did a great job with it with the racial stuff, is you're helping to lower the defenses through compassion and through being human. As an image bearer, we're human.
Yeah.
And what you're doing is you're saying this isn't just some entitled, ridiculous, out of touch generation. This is a generation that was born into the collective experience of modern trauma.
That's right.
And their context is that they don't understand safety the way we understood it. I remember before Columbine, not to get into it and all that, but that
Right.
was a turning point.
Yes.
And so that idea of that schools have been so securitized, like I even think of what happened in Uvalde. Like as you were saying that, I was holding it together because it's not a question, Amy, of if, but when
Right.
the next shooting happens. That is reality.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
so that is something that's a conversation that you have to have with a 5 or 7 year old, not
Right.
just a 15 or 17-year-old. So just
Exactly.
that frame of, guys, think about what they're going through. The pandemic wasn't easy for us. Do you think it was easy
Right.
for them?
Right.
That was formative for them in such a way where for some people it's canceled hope.
Mm-hmm.
Like they're also being told, who knows, there could be nuclear war coming up. We
Right.
globalization, like their worlds are very fractured.
Yes.
And what we do is we look at their lifelines as social media, and we look at it in a very, I think, condemning way.
We do.
But that is a lifeline. That's a support system for them, and
Yes.
in a way that I think you hit on really well at the conference as well. But anyway, thank you for helping people who are just ready to look down and condemn them to have some compassion.
Yeah.
I think that's what's most needed right now, Amy.
Yeah. Well, and I think about what you said earlier in this conversation about how they are the future. I mean, the moment
Yes.
you've been able to conceive of this world being yours, it's not. You know,
Yeah.
our
So
lives
true.
move so fast,
Yeah.
and so the world already belongs to these kids, these young
Yeah.
adults. Um, they're inheriting whatever we leave for them, but they're also repurposing the tools and changing the rules and making the world their own in the way that they should. And we have a hard time partnering with them or even releasing some things to them. Um, but ready or not, that is happening. And so, those of us who have been entrusted with teaching or mentoring or caring for these Gen Z adolescents and young adults, I think the best way forward is to be trauma attentive,
Mm.
to be trauma informed, to understand what they're up against and how that has shaped who they are, so that they have the best shot possible at being able to lead hopeful, whole lives. Um, we should want that for these kids. But that means taking them seriously. It means partnering with them. It means listening, and being willing to admit where our lives are different.
Mm.
And so that's pretty critically important, I think. Um, and so, some practical things that I have found helpful with my students is like one, just being a validating presence.
Mm.
So when a student says like, I'm struggling with depression. And it's, the 10th student that said that to you in, the last few days. And you're like, oh, they're all depressed. That's the temptation. But instead going, gosh, why are they all depressed? Right? Like rather than brushing it away, going, oh, this is bad. They're trying to tell us something. Um, or when my student emails me and says like, I'm having a meltdown and I don't know what to do. And instead being like, well, they just need to buck up, being like, okay, why does the student not have what they need today? And
Hmm.
and how can I come alongside them compassionately and in a very compassionate way, get them in touch with the resources that are going to help them. Get them in touch with life-giving resources that will help them get from point A to point B. Um, And then also like in my own teaching, like, and I've also talked about this with ministers, um, but like with my students, having an awareness of their bodies, right? If bodies keep the score, if the bodies hold the stories, That means that sometimes our Gen Z students don't know how to tell us what they're feeling, and they don't
Wow.
always know how to tell us like where it's coming from.
Hmm.
And so just knowing that the bodies hold stories, and then being gentle with that, being sensitive or attentive. And so in my own classroom, sometimes that looks like breathing, like a breath prayer, starting class with a breath prayer, um, breathing in an attribute of God, like God is merciful and gracious, and then like releasing fear and anxiety for today, or something like that. But just easing them into some healthy ways of relating to their own bodies and caring for their own bodies. Um, I also am attentive to like the feeling in the room. Like, so if students come in and it's like high anxiety, then I will take the extra time to ask about it. I'll be like, hey, so what does your week look like? How many of you have big projects coming up? How many of you have exams? And they'll raise their hands. Um, and then I also have like a prayer book that I pass around, and they can write prayer requests in the book. If they're not in a place to self-disclose what's weighing on them, they can put it in the book or whatever. And even if they never raise their hand about stress or they never write in the book, what I've done in that moment is I've shown them that I care. And
Hmm.
I've shown them this is a room where like you are being held, where your life is welcome. Um, and you I see you and I care about you. And just offering that kind of safety makes it more possible for the students to step into learning. Um, if they feel any ounce of safety, as safe as they can
Right.
feel in a school environment, for example, um, it makes it a better learning environment for them. And then I also do some what I call text blocking, and I learned this from
Yeah.
other amazing professors, but like reading a story from scripture and inviting students to self select and to come down and like take on a physical posture of a character in the story I'm reading. And they kind of do a tableau. And then I ask them, like, so let's say I've read the story of the woman who was bleeding for 12 years and she tugs on Jesus's cloak. And I've invited my students to block this. So I've got like a student who's Jesus, and he might be standing or she might be standing and they're turning and looking. And then, somebody is being the woman who's bleeding and they might be reaching up to Jesus. And then you've got the crowd pressing in. And I'll go around and ask each of the students, so what do you see in the story from this perspective? So you're being Jesus right now. What do you see? And
Mm.
they might say, well, I see the crowds. I'm like, well, what's the facial expression of the crowd? What do they notice the woman? What do you see with the woman and what does it feel like? And then I go to the woman who's down here. What do you see? Well, I'm looking up at Jesus. I'm looking up at the crowds, and it's this kind of physical play that draws them out of their own bodies for a moment, and they're imagining a different perspective, trying something on. And then I'll have them switch up characters sometimes. So, okay, Jesus, now you're going to be the woman, and the woman, now you're going to be Jesus. Now, what do you see? And then when they get back in their seats, every single time, they look more comfortable. Even if
Wow.
the exercise is like deeply uncomfortable, but then they're back in their seats and they're kind of returning to their bodies. And it's like, ooh, and it's a little bit of a reset, And so there are these different things that you can do to tend to the bodies in the room that can be really meaningful and very attentive to where people are and can ultimately open up avenues for learning. Yeah.
I I love that. And one of the things that you also kind of covered. So I love all the different ways that you like practically intervene.
Yeah.
Um, and I also appreciate the reframe that you give us on how to look at them.
Mm.
I always ask people, it's interesting, we make disparaging comments towards the next generation constantly. My question always to people is, well, who raised them? It's always a million. I mean, and it just is so interesting to me how disparaging we can be.
Yeah.
And we created the world for them.
Mm-hmm.
We created this world.
Yeah.
And I guess I'm wanting to know, just as a parting shot, or just one little last piece with it, is when it comes to social media, right?
Yeah,
Because to your point, it does create this 24/7 news cycle for them of bad news, tragedy, trauma. And I do think that social media does have some negative effects on the brain.
sure.
And at the same time, underneath that is this yearning for connectedness that I
Yeah,
think gets pathologized.
yeah,
So people will be like, "Oh, there's all these kids in a circle. They're not talking. They're on their phones." I get that.
right.
But what's up? Shed a little bit of intel for us on what's happening in terms from a process
Mhm.
perspective for
Yeah.
them.
Yeah. So something that's pretty interesting is I've been asking my students. I did this both semesters this past year, where I said, "Okay, tell me what is the greatest source of distress in your lives?" And they all almost unanimously will like hold up their phones. And they're like, "My phone. My phone is the greatest source of distress." I'm like, "Right, yeah." That makes sense, and
Yeah.
as someone who was born in the 80s who witnessed the rise of personal cell phones and like having that thing in your pocket all the time and beckoning your attention all the time, I'm like, that tracks. It seems pretty distressing. But then I say, how many of you think you could go without it for a day? And nobody can imagine it. Every now and then I might have like one student who's like, yeah, I think maybe I could do a day. They really can't conceive of their lives without it. And so I've had some meaningful conversations with these students about why that is. And they're constantly telling me, like, well, this is how we communicate. Like, this is how I know what's going on with my friends. This is how I know what's going on in my social environment.
Hmm.
This is, and some of them have even indicated, like, this is what's providing for them a sense of normalcy.
Wow.
So, in a world where they might feel isolated or under threat, social media gives them a sense of normalcy. It's a way of connecting into some generational norms, a way of
Hmm.
participating in a cohort. And so I don't want us to underestimate the the significance of social media as a connecting point for these students. It's not a perfect medium by any means, and mediums do shape us. Like there's something formational happening in this generation in the way that they are mediating themselves through social media. But I also want us to be able to nuance and complicate and say, so maybe they're being formed in some bad ways, but also if you were to take it away, they would suddenly be like, out adrift without a paddle, like just this is their primary mode of connecting. And something else that I think is really important for our understanding of Gen Z is sometimes older generations look at Gen Z and they're like, Gen Z is woke, or Gen Z is mobilized, or Gen Z is, anything goes. Like all the old cultural rules that applied no longer apply to Gen Z. And part of what we're seeing is that Gen Z, in being a social media generation, they have constant access to stories of people who are different from them.
Mm-hmm.
And the buffer that's created on social media or in technology in general makes it possible for somebody to sit back without having to have everything right, the right words or the right approach. They can sit back and receive a story and gauge it, even gain compassion for it, and learn about it with considerably less risk. And
Very
so
true.
Gen Z is gaining cultural aptitude,
Mm.
aptitude at a much faster rate than any prior generation. And of course, Gen Z is variegated. Like there are conservative, there are liberal, there are extroverted and introverted. There are those who are more compassionate and less compassionate. We all like there's a very much a visible movement of like masculinity coming up through Gen Z, which I think is a really interesting phenomenon. So they're not all the same, right? It's not like
Right.
all a bunch of like woke kids, but what they do have in common is that they're on these platforms where they are interacting with stories of people who are different from them much more than any of us ever could before. And I think that that actually is a gain. I think that that's significant. And it's an area where Gen Z has the capacity to heal some of our wounds.
Wow.
And so there's a possibility for reciprocity. One last thing I'll say is sometimes I
Yeah.
think in the disparagement that happens between generations, I think sometimes older generations were just hoping that their wounds would get validated, and maybe their wounds went unvalidated. And so now they're looking at the younger generation going, well, you better buck up because that's what I've done.
Absolutely.
And I wonder what it might look like to, especially in our churches, seek some intergenerational healing. Um, some healing that only becomes possible when in those kind of like intergenerational reciprocal interactions, developing a sense of mutuality and accountability across generations, so that this generation can say, hey, I see your wounds. I see you. I see God meeting you in this place. And then the younger generation can turn to the older generation and say, I see your wounds and I see what God is doing in those wounds. Like, I wonder what might be possible in terms of how God is restoring us and how God is bringing us to wholeness.
But real quickly, there's going to be people that want to get in contact or people who want to
Mhm.
know more. You've got
Yeah.
an article that you're going to be
Mhm.
that you're going to be doing. Is there anything else that are you going to write? Are you writing a book? Like I'm in. Like I want to know what you're up to.
Yes, I have multiple writing projects right now. I love to write. So I'm in the process of converting my dissertation into a book. So you have to keep an ear out for that. That's going to be a slow
Yes.
project, but it's going to happen.
Okay.
Um, and then I'm in talks with a friend of mine. We're working on a book together. I'm working on an article that will be published in Religions journal coming up. So I've got some different projects. So if you keep your ear to the ground for my name, you'll see those publications materializing in the coming year or two. Um, but a way to get in touch with me if you have questions is I work at Abilene Christian University. If you go to Abilene Christian University's website and look for my faculty profile, you will find my email address.
Okay.
And I welcome you to reach out if you have questions or if you would like to continue the conversation. Um, I also am pretty active in some academic conferences, so the Christian Scholars Conference,
Hmm.
and also the Academy of Homiletics, the Society of Biblical Literature, and American
Hmm.
Academy of Religion. And so I like to be engaged in conversations at conferences. So if you ever
Mm.
find yourself at one of those conferences, look me up. I'd love to get together and chat.
Oh, that is so good. And thank you so much. Well, I want to tell you what I tell all my guests. That we are with you and God is for you, my sister Amy. Thank you for joining us today. You have been a blessing.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.